My neighbor told me that real women don't need help with anything, especially not from strangers. 3 weeks later, she was standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, mascara streaked down her cheeks, begging me to cancel the service I'd hired. The same service she'd mocked me for even considering. The irony wasn't lost on me, but the satisfaction I felt watching her panic definitely was. I never thought I'd be the type of person who needed to hire help for basic life maintenance. I'm Sarah, 32, work in marketing for a mid-sized company that sells industrial cleaning supplies to hotels. Not glamorous, but it pays the bills and gives me enough flexibility to work from home 3 days a week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I live in Riverside Heights, one of those cookie-cutter suburban neighborhoods, where everyone's lawn is exactly the same shade of green and the mailboxes all match. You know, the type of place where your biggest controversy is whether the HOA should allow decorative garden gnomes or not. My house is a modest 2-bedroom ranch with a decent backyard and a kitchen that gets good morning light. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I bought it 2 years ago after my divorce from Marcus, who decided that being married meant he could stop contributing to household chores entirely because his job was more important than mine. That's a story for another day, but let's just say I learned a lot about self-reliance during those final months of our marriage when I was essentially running a household solo while he played video games and complained that dinner wasn't ready when he wanted it. After the divorce, I threw myself into making the house exactly how I wanted it. I painted the living room a soft sage green, hung plants in every window, and set up a little home office in the spare bedroom with a view of the backyard. I was proud of my independence, proud of how I'd created this peaceful space that was entirely my own. I handled the mortgage payments, the utility bills, the yard work, the repairs, all of it. I was proving to myself and everyone else that I didn't need anyone to take care of me. That's where Janet comes in. Janet Morrison, my next-door neighbor, 50-something with perfectly styled blonde hair that never moves even in wind, and the kind of sharp smile that makes you feel like you're being evaluated for purchase. She moved in about 6 months after I did, with her husband Dale, who works in insurance and has the personality of wet cardboard. Janet doesn't work outside the home, which she mentions frequently, usually in the context of how busy she is managing their household, and how she couldn't imagine trying to balance a career on top of domestic responsibilities. From day one, Janet made it clear that she had opinions about how I lived my life. Not directly, of course. She's too polished for outright criticism. Instead, she'd make observations. Comments like, "Oh, you're mowing your lawn again. I keep telling Dale how impressed I am that you do all that heavy work yourself." Or, "I noticed you had another repair van in your driveway. It's so expensive hiring people for every little thing, isn't it?" The comments were always delivered with a smile and a tone that could be interpreted as supportive if you weren't paying attention to the underlying message. But I was paying attention, and the message was clear. Janet thought I was trying too hard to prove something, and she found my independence either pitiable or performative. Things escalated gradually. Janet would appear in her front yard whenever I was working outside, finding reasons to start conversations that always seemed to circle back to how capable she was at managing her home and family. She'd mention how she canned her own vegetables, made her husband's lunch every morning, kept their house spotless without ever hiring a cleaning service, and handled all the household scheduling and maintenance coordination herself. "Real women know how to take care of their homes," she said one Saturday morning while I was struggling to install a new porch light fixture. I'd been at it for over an hour, and the instructions might as well have been written in ancient Greek. "We don't need to pay strangers to come into our personal space and do things we should be able to handle ourselves." I was balanced on a ladder, holding a screwdriver in one hand and trying to keep the fixture steady with the other, when she made this pronouncement. I looked down at her, standing there in her pristine gardening outfit that had clearly never seen actual dirt, and felt something snap inside me. "Some of us work full-time jobs, Janet," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "We don't all have the luxury of making home maintenance our primary occupation." She laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Oh honey, it's not about time, it's about priorities. A real woman makes her home her priority, whether she works outside it or not. Hiring people to do things you should be doing yourself is just admitting you can't handle your own life." That stung more than I wanted to admit, probably because there was a tiny part of me that worried she might be right. Since the divorce, I'd been so focused on proving I could do everything alone that I'd been wearing myself thin trying to maintain the house, excel at work, and have some semblance of a social life. Most weeks, I felt like I was barely keeping my head above water. But I wasn't about to give Janet the satisfaction of knowing she'd hit a nerve. I turned back to the light fixture and continued wrestling with it in stubborn silence while she puttered around her perfect flower bed, occasionally glancing over with what I can only describe as smug satisfaction. The light fixture took me 3 more hours to install, and even then, it hung slightly crooked. Every time I looked at it, I thought about Janet's words and felt a mixture of frustration and determination. I was handling my life just fine, thank you very much. I didn't need her approval or her advice. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, I found myself noticing all the little things around the house that needed attention. The guest bathroom faucet that dripped. The squeaky hinge on the back door. The way the baseboards in the hallway had collected dust despite my regular vacuuming efforts. The small chip in the kitchen tile that I kept meaning to fix but never seemed to find the time for. Each task felt manageable on its own, but together they formed this growing list of maintenance items that followed me around like a persistent headache. I'd lie in bed on Sunday nights, mentally cataloging everything that needed to be done, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of small repairs and upkeep tasks that seemed to multiply when I wasn't looking. Meanwhile, Janet's house remained pristine. Her lawn was always perfectly edged, her flower beds were weed-free, and every window sparkled. She made it look effortless, which only made me feel more inadequate about my own struggles to keep up with basic home maintenance while working 40+ hours a week. The breaking point came on a particularly stressful Tuesday in October. I'd been dealing with a difficult client at work, who kept changing the specifications for a major campaign we were launching. I'd spent most of the day on calls, trying to manage their expectations while frantically revising marketing materials that had already been approved and sent to print. By the time I got home at 6:30, I was mentally exhausted and looking forward to a quiet evening with takeout and Netflix. Instead, I walked into my house and immediately noticed that the kitchen sink was backing up. Water was pooling around the drain, and there was an unpleasant smell coming from somewhere in the vicinity of the garbage disposal. I stood there staring at the murky water, feeling like this was the final straw in what had already been a terrible day. I tried running the disposal, which made an alarming grinding noise and didn't seem to help with the drainage situation. I tried plunging the sink, which resulted in dirty water splashing all over my work clothes and the surrounding counter. I tried pouring boiling water down the drain, which accomplished nothing except making the kitchen smell like wet dog, mixed with rotting food. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting on my kitchen floor in soggy clothes, surrounded by every cleaning product I owned, close to tears of frustration. The sink was still backing up, and I had no idea what to do next. I could call a plumber, but it was evening, and I knew that would mean paying emergency service rates. I could try to fix it myself, but I'd already exhausted my limited plumbing knowledge. That's when I heard Janet's voice outside my kitchen window, talking to Dale about their dinner plans. Her tone was bright and cheerful, the voice of someone whose biggest concern was whether to serve the salmon with rice pilaf or roasted vegetables. I felt a surge of resentment so strong it surprised me. Here I was, sitting on my floor in wet clothes, defeated by a kitchen sink, while Janet floated through life in her bubble of domestic perfection. She'd probably never had to deal with a backed-up drain because she was too competent to let problems develop in the first place. Real women, according to Janet, handled these things before they became emergencies. I pulled out my phone and did something I'd been considering for weeks but had been too proud to actually try. I searched for home maintenance services near me. The first result was a company called Complete Care Solutions. Their website was clean and professional, with testimonials from satisfied customers and a comprehensive list of services that included everything from basic repairs to deep cleaning to seasonal maintenance. "We handle the tasks you don't have time for," their tagline read, "so you can focus on what matters most to you." I scrolled through their service packages, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. They offered everything from one-time repairs to ongoing maintenance contracts. They had licensed technicians, background-checked staff, and a satisfaction guarantee. It looked legitimate and professional, nothing like the fly-by-night handyman services that Janet probably imagined when she talked about hiring strangers. But I could hear her voice in my head. Real women don't need to pay people to do things they should be able to handle themselves. Was hiring help really an admission of failure? Was I proving that I couldn't manage my own life? I looked around my kitchen, at the standing water in the sink, at the cleaning supplies scattered across the floor, at my reflection in the dark window looking tired and defeated. Maybe Janet was right, maybe I was just making excuses for my own inadequacy. Then my phone rang. It was my best friend Emma, calling from her apartment in the city, where she lived with her boyfriend and their 2 cats. Emma worked as a graphic designer for a nonprofit, put in long hours, and somehow always seemed to have her life together in a way that made me envious. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, and something in my voice when I answered must have given away my emotional state because she immediately shifted into concerned friend mode. I found myself telling her about the sink, about the growing list of home maintenance tasks, about Janet's comments and my own feelings of inadequacy. Emma listened without interruption, making occasional sympathetic noises, until I finished my rant with, "Maybe I should just be able to handle this stuff myself. Maybe Janet's right, and I'm just making excuses." There was a pause, and then Emma started laughing. Not mean laughter, but the kind of incredulous laughter you make when someone says something so absurd you can't quite believe they're serious. "Sarah," she said, "you realize that's completely insane, right? You work full-time at a demanding job, you maintain a house and a yard by yourself. You're doing the work of 2 people, and you're beating yourself up because you don't also have time to become an expert plumber. That's not being inadequate, that's being human." "But Janet manages everything herself," I protested. "She makes it look so easy." "Janet doesn't have a full-time job," Emma pointed out. "Managing a household is literally her job. And even if it weren't, so what? Different people have different strengths and different resources. Some people are good at home repairs, some people are good at other things. Some people have time for DIY projects, some people would rather pay professionals and spend their free time doing things they actually enjoy." She paused, and I could hear her moving around her apartment, probably cleaning up after dinner. "You know what I did last week, when my bathroom faucet started leaking? I called a plumber. You know what I'm doing this weekend, instead of learning how to fix faucets? I'm going to a pottery class with Mike, because that's how I want to spend my time. There's no shame in paying people to do things you don't want to do, or don't have time to learn." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling slightly better but still conflicted. Emma made good points, but she didn't have to live next door to Janet, and her running commentary on proper womanhood. I could imagine the look on Janet's face if I told her I'd hired a home maintenance service. The barely concealed superiority, the implication that I was taking the easy way out, the suggestion that real women don't need that kind of help. But then I looked at the water, still standing in my sink, thought about all the other small repairs I'd been putting off, and made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I didn't care what Janet thought. I was tired of spending my weekends wrestling with home improvement projects I didn't understand and didn't enjoy. I was tired of feeling guilty for not being naturally gifted at plumbing and electrical work. I was tired of Janet's passive-aggressive comments about real women and their capabilities. I pulled up the Complete Care Solutions website again and filled out their contact form. I requested a consultation for comprehensive home maintenance services, including immediate attention to my kitchen sink situation. I provided my contact information and a detailed description of the various tasks I'd been struggling with. Within an hour, I received a call from Maria, one of their customer service representatives. She was friendly and professional, asking specific questions about my needs and explaining their different service packages. She assured me that the sink backup was a common issue that their technicians could handle quickly, and she scheduled an appointment for the following morning. "We'll send out Jake, one of our senior technicians," she explained. "He's been with the company for 5 years and has excellent reviews for kitchen and bathroom repairs. He'll take a look at your sink situation first, then do a walkthrough of your house to assess the other maintenance items you mentioned. We'll provide you with a comprehensive plan and pricing options." After I hung up, I felt lighter than I had in weeks.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I wouldn't have to spend another weekend trying to figure out plumbing repairs or feeling frustrated by tasks that were outside my skill set. I could focus on work, on spending time with friends, on hobbies I actually enjoyed. I could live in a house that was properly maintained without having to become an expert in every aspect of home repair. The next morning, I took the day off work to meet with Jake from Complete Care Solutions. He arrived at exactly 9 o'clock in a clean company van, wearing a professional uniform and carrying a toolbox that looked like it belonged to someone who actually knew how to use the tools inside it. Jake was probably in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of competent demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He listened carefully as I explained the sink situation and the other maintenance issues I'd been dealing with. He asked thoughtful questions about when problems had started and what I'd already tried to fix them. Within 20 minutes, he diagnosed the sink problem as a combination of built-up grease and a partial blockage in the garbage disposal. He had the right tools to clear both issues, and by 10:30, my sink was draining perfectly for the first time in weeks. He also tightened the loose faucet handle I'd been meaning to address and adjusted the disposal to eliminate the grinding noise I'd been ignoring. "This is pretty typical," he explained as he cleaned up his tools. "Most people don't realize that garbage disposals need regular maintenance beyond just running them. The buildup you had was probably developing for months." We then walked through the rest of the house, and Jake assessed each of the maintenance items I'd been struggling with. The squeaky door hinge needed a specific type of lubricant. The dripping bathroom faucet required a new washer that cost less than $5, but required removing the entire faucet assembly to install. The chipped kitchen tile could be repaired with a simple color-matched compound, but the trick was knowing which product worked best with my particular type of tile. Each task Jake described sounded simple when he explained it, but I realized that what made them simple for him was years of experience and the right tools and materials. I didn't have the knowledge base to diagnose problems correctly, and I didn't have the specialized tools that made repairs efficient rather than frustrating. A lot of our clients are professionals who are great at their own jobs but don't want to become experts in home maintenance, Jake said as we completed the walkthrough. "There's no shame in delegating tasks that aren't in your wheelhouse. You wouldn't expect a plumber to design your marketing campaigns, right?" That perspective shifted something fundamental in how I thought about hiring help. It wasn't about inadequacy or failure, it was about specialization and efficient use of time. I was good at my job because I'd invested years in developing those skills. Jake was good at home repairs because he'd done the same thing in his field. We discussed service packages, and I decided on their monthly maintenance plan. For a reasonable fee, Complete Care would handle routine maintenance tasks, seasonal preparations, and emergency repairs. They'd come by once a month to check on everything and address any developing issues before they became major problems. As Jake packed up his equipment, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. My sink worked perfectly, my house had a maintenance plan, and I'd stopped apologizing for not being naturally gifted at plumbing. I was looking forward to spending my weekend doing things I actually enjoyed instead of wrestling with home repair projects that left me frustrated and defeated. That's when I noticed Janet standing in her front yard, pruning roses with the intense focus of someone who was actually paying more attention to my driveway than her garden. She'd clearly been watching Jake's van and waiting for an opportunity to investigate what was happening at my house. As Jake loaded his equipment into the van, Janet made her move. She walked over with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission, carrying her pruning shears like a weapon of suburban warfare. "Good morning, Sarah," she called out in her bright, fake-friendly voice. "I hope everything's all right." I saw the service truck and was worried there might be some kind of emergency. I could see Jake glance at me with the slightly amused expression of someone who'd dealt with nosy neighbors before. I felt a moment of embarrassment, wondering what he thought about Janet's transparent attempt to gather information about my personal business. "Everything's fine," I replied, trying to match her cheerful tone. "Just having some maintenance work done." Janet's smile became more strained. "Oh, how nice that you found someone reliable. It can be so hard to find trustworthy people to let into your home these days. I hope it wasn't too expensive for just basic repairs." The emphasis on just basic repairs was clearly intended to suggest that I was overpaying for tasks I should have been able to handle myself. I felt the familiar surge of defensive anger, but before I could respond, Jake stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Jake from Complete Care Solutions," he said, extending his hand to Janet with professional courtesy. "Sarah's set up one of our comprehensive maintenance packages. Smart move, really. Preventive maintenance saves a lot of money in the long run, and it keeps everything running smoothly." Janet shook his hand with obvious reluctance. "I'm sure it's very convenient," she said, her tone suggesting that convenience was roughly equivalent to moral failure. "I just think there's something to be said for taking care of your own home. Learning to handle repairs yourself builds character." Jake smiled politely. "That's one approach, certainly. But I've got clients who are doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, all kinds of professionals who'd rather spend their free time with family or hobbies, instead of troubleshooting plumbing problems. Everyone's got different priorities." I watched Janet's expression shift as Jake spoke. She'd clearly expected him to be some kind of sketchy handyman she could dismiss easily, but his professional manner and reasonable explanations were harder to argue with. She was stuck in a position where criticizing my decision meant implying that doctors and lawyers were also making poor choices, which was difficult to do without sounding unreasonable. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose not everyone has the time to learn proper home maintenance skills. Or the interest," Jake added cheerfully. "Sarah mentioned she works in marketing. I bet she's got skills I could never develop. That's the beauty of specialization, right? Everyone does what they're best at." After Jake left, Janet lingered in my driveway for a few more minutes, clearly hoping to continue the conversation and perhaps extract more details about what I'd paid for the service. But I'd reached my limit for Janet's commentary on my life choices. "I should get back to work," I said, heading toward my front door. "Have a good day, Janet." I could feel her watching me as I went inside, probably calculating how much I'd spent and preparing her next lecture about real women and self-reliance. But for the first time in months, I didn't care what Janet thought about my choices. My sink worked perfectly. My house had a maintenance plan that would prevent small problems from becoming major headaches. I had my weekend back to spend on things I actually enjoyed instead of battling home repair projects that left me frustrated and resentful. Most importantly, I'd stopped apologizing for recognizing my own limitations and making practical decisions about how to spend my time and energy. If that made me less of a real woman in Janet's estimation, I could live with her disapproval. I had no idea how dramatically that decision would change the dynamic of our neighborly relationship, or how quickly Janet's criticism would transform into something that looked suspiciously like panic. But that afternoon, as I sat in my perfectly functioning kitchen, planning a weekend that wouldn't involve any plumbing disasters, I felt more confident in my choices than I had in months. The real test of those choices was still to come. 3 months into my maintenance contract with Complete Care Solutions, something strange started happening. Janet's perfect facade began showing cracks, and those cracks were getting wider by the week. It started small. I noticed her morning routine becoming more erratic. Instead of her usual 7:30 garden inspection in full makeup and coordinated activewear, she'd appear outside at random times looking increasingly frazzled. Her hair wasn't always styled to perfection, and more than once I caught glimpses of her through her kitchen window in the same clothes she'd worn the day before. The first real sign something was wrong came on a Thursday morning in January. I was getting ready for work when I heard raised voices from next door. Not just conversation, but actual shouting. Janet's voice, high and strained, was arguing with someone about money. I couldn't make out all the words, but I definitely heard late payment and 30 days behind and can't keep doing this. I'd never heard Janet raise her voice before. In the 2 years I'd known her, she'd maintained this image of serene domestic control, speaking in measured tones about her perfectly managed household. The shouting was so out of character that I found myself pausing my morning routine to listen, wondering if I should be concerned about a domestic violence situation. But the voice responding to her wasn't Dale's familiar monotone. It was a woman's voice, older, with the kind of authority that suggested official business. After about 10 minutes, the conversation ended, and I heard a car door slam followed by an engine starting. Through my bedroom window, I watched a woman in a business suit walk away from Janet's front door, carrying a clipboard and looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. When I left for work 20 minutes later, Janet was standing in her driveway, staring at a piece of paper in her hands. Her face was pale, and her usually perfect posture had collapsed into something that looked like defeat. She glanced up when she heard my car door, and for just a moment, I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Our eyes met across the space between our driveways, and I felt an unexpected impulse to ask if she was okay. But before I could say anything, Janet's face rearranged itself into a strained approximation of her usual smile. "Good morning, Sarah," she called out, her voice bright but brittle. "Off to work. How wonderful that some of us have such predictable schedules." The comment had her usual edge, but it felt forced, like she was reading lines from a script she'd forgotten how to perform convincingly. I nodded and got in my car, but as I backed out of my driveway, I caught another glimpse of her in my rearview mirror. The moment she thought I couldn't see her, the fake smile disappeared, and she crumpled the paper in her hands with a violence that made me wonder what exactly had been written on it. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other changes. Janet's perfect lawn began developing brown patches and weeds. Her flower beds, usually maintained with museum-quality precision, started looking neglected. The windows of her house, which had always sparkled, developed a film of dust and water spots. More telling were the changes in her routine criticism of my life choices. Janet had always found ways to comment on my decisions, particularly my choice to hire professional help for home maintenance. But lately her comments had become more sporadic and less focused. She seemed distracted during our driveway encounters, like she was going through the motions of neighborhood superiority without really investing in the performance. The breakthrough came on a Saturday morning in February. I was in my garage organizing storage bins when I heard what sounded like crying coming from Janet's backyard. Not dramatic sobbing, but the quiet, exhausted kind of crying that comes from someone who's been holding things together for too long and finally reached their breaking point. I debated whether to investigate. Janet and I weren't friends, exactly. Our relationship had always been built on a foundation of polite antagonism, with her criticizing my choices and me defending my independence. But there's something about hearing another person cry that cuts through social awkwardness and appeals to basic human decency. I walked to the fence that separated our backyards and peered through a gap between the boards. Janet was sitting on her back porch steps, still in her bathrobe at 11 in the morning, holding a coffee mug and staring at what looked like a stack of bills spread out on the step beside her. Her shoulders were shaking, and she was wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her robe. "Janet," I called softly through the fence. "Are you okay?" She startled, quickly wiping her face and trying to arrange the papers into a neat pile. "Oh, Sarah, I'm fine, just enjoying the morning air." Her voice was thick with recent tears, and the lie was so transparent it was almost painful to witness. I'd spent enough years married to someone who preferred pretense to honesty to recognize the signs of someone desperately trying to maintain appearances while their world fell apart. "You don't sound fine," I said gently. "Is there anything I can help with?" There was a long pause. I could see Janet's profile through the fence gap, and she looked like she was having an internal debate about whether to maintain facade or admit that something was seriously wrong. The facade won, but barely. "Everything's perfectly manageable," she said, but her voice cracked on the word manageable. "Just some minor financial adjustments. Nothing that proper planning can't handle." Financial adjustment. That explained the woman with the clipboard, the shouting about late payments, Janet's increasingly erratic behavior. She was having money problems, serious ones, and her perfect life was apparently not as perfectly managed as she'd always claimed. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "Because if you need to talk to someone, I'm available. I know we don't always see eye to eye, but neighbors should look out for each other." Janet stood up abruptly, gathering the papers against her chest like she was protecting state secrets. "I appreciate the offer, but I can handle my own affairs. Real women don't burden others with their personal problems." Even in crisis, she couldn't resist taking a shot at my supposed inadequacy. But this time, the criticism felt hollow, like she was reciting a mantra she no longer believed but couldn't stop repeating. After that conversation, I started paying closer attention to the signs of Janet's deteriorating situation. Her car, usually pristine, developed a coating of grime and what looked like a small dent in the back bumper. The newspapers started piling up on her driveway, suggesting she wasn't maintaining her usual schedule of morning yard work. Most telling, she stopped making her passive-aggressive comments about my life choices altogether, as if she no longer had the energy to maintain her role as the neighborhood authority on proper womanhood. Then Complete Care Solutions inadvertently provided me with insight into exactly how serious Janet's problems had become. It was a Tuesday morning, and Miguel, one of their technicians, was at my house performing the monthly maintenance check. He was working on adjusting my front door lock when he mentioned something that caught my attention. "You know," he said, "while testing the deadbolt mechanism, we had someone else on this street inquire about our services recently. Your neighbor actually." He gestured toward Janet's house. Woman with blonde hair, very put together. She seemed really interested in our comprehensive package, asked a lot of detailed questions about pricing and payment plans. I felt a jolt of surprise. Janet had inquired about Complete Care Solutions. The same woman who'd lectured me about real women not needing to hire strangers for basic home maintenance. Did she sign up for service? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Miguel shook his head. No, she didn't follow through. Which was too bad, because she clearly needed help. I did a quick assessment, and she's got some serious issues developing. Foundation settling, roof problems, electrical work that needs attention. The kind of stuff that gets expensive fast if you don't address it early. Foundation settling, roof problems, electrical issues. No wonder Janet looked terrified. Those weren't the kind of problems you could solve with determination and YouTube tutorials. They required professional intervention, and professional intervention cost serious money. When was this? I asked. About a month ago, Miguel replied. She seemed really stressed about it. Kept asking about payment plans and whether we offered any kind of discount programs. I gave her all the information, but she said she needed to think about it. He finished with the lock and tested it one more time. Honestly, from what I could see, thinking about it is a luxury she doesn't really have. Some of those problems are going to get worse whether she addresses them or not. After Miguel left, I found myself thinking about Janet's situation with a mixture of sympathy and irony that I wasn't entirely comfortable with. For 2 years, she'd positioned herself as the authority on proper home management, criticizing my choices and implying that hiring professional help was a sign of weakness or inadequacy. Now she was facing problems that required exactly the kind of professional intervention she'd always scorned, and apparently she couldn't afford it. The irony was almost poetic, but it didn't feel as satisfying as I'd expected. Watching someone's life fall apart, even someone who'd been consistently critical and condescending, wasn't the triumph I might have imagined. It just felt sad and complicated. Over the next few weeks, the evidence of Janet's mounting problems became harder to ignore. I started noticing service vehicles at her house, a roofer's truck one morning, an electrician's van the following week. But these weren't the extended visits that suggested actual work being done. They were brief consultations, the kind that usually resulted in estimates that made homeowners very unhappy. I knew this because I'd been through the same process during my first year in the house, when I'd gotten quotes for various repairs and improvements. The difference was that I'd been able to afford the work I'd needed, either by paying directly or by budgeting for it over time. Janet apparently didn't have those options. The breakthrough in understanding her full situation came through an unexpected source. I was checking my mail one evening when Dale approached me from their driveway. This was unusual because Dale typically avoided any kind of social interaction beyond the most basic neighborly acknowledgments. He was the kind of person who waved from a distance but never initiated conversations. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying an awkwardness that suggested he wasn't comfortable with whatever he was about to say. "I wonder if I could ask you something." I turned to face him fully, noting that he looked as tired and stressed as Janet had been looking lately. His usually neat appearance was rumpled, and he had the kind of exhausted demeanor that comes from dealing with problems bigger than your resources. "Of course," I said. "What's up?" He glanced back toward his house, as if checking to make sure Janet wasn't watching, then stepped closer to the property line between our driveways. "The company you use for home maintenance," he said quietly. "Complete Care Solutions. Are they expensive?" The question confirmed what I'd suspected about their financial situation, but hearing it directly from Dale made it more real. They weren't just facing routine money troubles. They were struggling with the basic costs of homeownership. It depends on what you need, I replied carefully. They have different service levels. Why? Dale rubbed his forehead with the palm of his hand, a gesture that looked like he'd been doing it frequently lately. We've got some issues with the house. Serious ones. And Janet, he paused, seeming to struggle with how much to reveal. Janet's always handled the household management, and she's very particular about maintaining standards. But some of these problems are beyond what she can manage alone. This was clearly difficult for him to admit. I could see the conflict between his loyalty to his wife and his recognition that their situation required help they couldn't provide themselves. What kind of problems? I asked. Foundation issues in the basement. Water damage from a roof leak we didn't catch early enough. Some electrical problems that the inspector says could be dangerous. He shook his head. We've gotten estimates, but they're all more than we can handle right now. Janet keeps thinking she can find ways to fix things herself or find cheaper solutions, but it's getting worse. I felt a surge of sympathy for both of them. They were dealing with the kind of cascading home maintenance problems that could financially devastate a family, especially if they'd been living paycheck to paycheck without significant savings for emergencies. Complete Care might be able to help, I said. They work with people on payment plans, and they're good at prioritizing repairs, based on what's most urgent. Miguel mentioned they'd already done an assessment for you. Dale nodded. Janet met with them, but she's resistant to the idea. She feels like hiring professionals is admitting failure, like it means she can't take care of our home properly. He looked directly at me for the first time in the conversation. She's always been proud of being self-sufficient, and this situation is really hard on her self-image. That explained a lot about Janet's recent behavior. Her identity was built around being the perfect homemaker who could handle anything domestic life threw at her. Facing problems that required professional intervention and significant financial resources wasn't just a practical challenge, it was an existential threat to how she saw herself. Maybe I could talk to her, I offered, though I wasn't sure how productive that conversation would be given our history. Dale's expression brightened slightly. Would you? I think hearing from someone who's actually used their services might help. She respects your independence, even if she doesn't always show it in the best way. That was a generous interpretation of Janet's behavior toward me, but I appreciated Dale's attempt to frame our relationship positively. It also gave me insight into how Janet actually viewed my choices, despite her public criticism. I'll think about how to approach it, I said. These are sensitive topics. I know, Dale replied, and I appreciate you even considering it. We're just running out of options, and Janet's pride is preventing her from accepting help we really need. After Dale went back inside, I stood in my driveway thinking about the complexity of the situation. Janet had spent 2 years positioning herself as superior to me because of her domestic capabilities and self-reliance. Now she was facing a crisis that challenged everything she'd built her identity around, and the solution required exactly the kind of professional help she'd always criticized me for using. The irony was still there, but it was overshadowed by the recognition that pride and fear were preventing her from getting help she desperately needed. Her house was developing serious problems that would only get worse with time, and her financial situation was apparently precarious enough that the necessary repairs felt overwhelming. I thought about my own experience with Complete Care Solutions and how much stress and frustration their services had eliminated from my life. My house was better maintained than it had ever been, and I had peace of mind knowing that problems would be caught and addressed before they became expensive emergencies. Janet could benefit from the same kind of professional support, but her attachment to self-reliance was standing in the way. The question was whether I could find a way to help her see that hiring professionals wasn't an admission of failure, but a practical decision that could actually preserve her home and her financial stability. Given our history of antagonistic interactions, it would require careful consideration of how to approach the topic without triggering her defensive reactions. I had no idea that Janet's situation was about to become much more desperate, or that my decision to reach out would lead to one of the most awkward and revealing conversations of my entire life. But standing in my driveway that evening, watching the lights come on in Janet's house while knowing the serious problems hidden behind those walls, I felt compelled to try to help, regardless of how she'd treated me in the past. The next morning, I would discover just how urgent her situation had become, and how dramatically her pride was about to collide with reality in a way that would change our relationship forever. The emergency happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:15. I was making coffee when I heard what sounded like a small explosion coming from Janet's house, followed immediately by shouting and the sound of running water. Through my kitchen window, I could see lights flickering on throughout their house in a pattern that suggested people moving frantically from room to room. 5 minutes later, Dale burst out of their front door wearing pajama pants and a bathrobe, running toward the street with his cell phone pressed to his ear. I could hear fragments of his conversation through my open window. Emergency plumber and flooding and basement full of water. By the time I threw on clothes and stepped outside, there were already 2 service trucks parked in front of Janet's house. Men in work boots were carrying equipment toward the front door, moving with the urgent efficiency of people responding to a plumbing disaster. Dale was standing in his driveway, gesturing frantically, while talking to someone who appeared to be the lead technician. That's when I saw Janet appear in their front doorway, and the sight stopped me cold. She was fully dressed despite the early hour, but her clothes were soaked from the knees down. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and her face had the hollow, shocked expression of someone whose worst fears had just materialized in spectacular fashion. She stood in the doorway, watching the emergency crew set up their equipment, and I could see her hands shaking from across the space between our houses. This wasn't just a plumbing problem. This was the catastrophic failure she'd been dreading, the expensive emergency that would force her to confront everything she'd been trying to avoid. I walked over to the property line, unsure what to say, but feeling compelled to offer help. "Janet, is everyone okay? What happened?" She turned toward me with eyes that looked glassy with unshed tears. "The foundation crack in the basement," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It finally gave way completely. Water's pouring in from somewhere behind the wall, and she gestured helplessly toward the house. "It's everywhere." One of the emergency technicians approached Dale and Janet with a clipboard and the kind of expression that never preceded good news. "Ma'am, we've shut off the main water line to stop the immediate flooding. But you've got a serious structural issue here. This isn't something we can patch temporarily. You're going to need foundation repair, waterproofing, probably some electrical work since water got into the basement panel." Janet's face went completely white. "How much are we talking about?" The technician consulted his notes. "For emergency mitigation, just to pump out the water and set up dehumidifiers, you're looking at about $3,000. The actual repairs." He paused, clearly recognizing that his estimate was going to be devastating news. "You'll need to get quotes from foundation specialists, but problems like this typically run $15,000 to $25,000 depending on how extensive the damage is." Janet made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "$25,000, she repeated, like she was testing whether the words sounded any less impossible when spoken aloud. Dale put his arm around her shoulders, but I could see the defeat in his posture too. They both knew they didn't have that kind of money, and they both knew the problem wasn't going to fix itself. "We'll need to start the emergency mitigation immediately," the technician continued. "Every hour we wait, the water damage gets worse. Mold can start developing within 24 hours in conditions like this." "Do it," Dale said quietly. "We don't have a choice." Janet nodded, but she looked like she was agreeing to her own execution. $3,000 for emergency mitigation, and that was just to stop the immediate damage. The actual solution would cost more money than they had, more money than they could borrow, more money than they could conceive of spending on a problem that had been developing for months, while she tried to manage it herself. I watched this exchange feeling a complicated mixture of sympathy and recognition. Janet had spent years criticizing my decision to hire professional help for routine maintenance, positioning herself as superior because of her self-reliance and domestic competence. Now she was facing exactly the kind of catastrophic failure that preventive maintenance was designed to avoid. The irony was impossible to ignore, but it didn't feel like the vindication I might have expected. Instead, I felt genuinely sorry for both of them. They were good people who'd made the mistake of prioritizing pride over practicality, and now they were paying a devastating price for that choice. As the emergency crew began setting up their equipment, Janet walked back toward her house with the slow, careful steps of someone in shock. She paused on her front porch and looked back at the trucks, the workers, the expensive machinery that was now the only thing standing between her family and complete disaster. That's when our eyes met across the space between our driveways, and I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before: complete surrender. Not just to the immediate crisis, but to the recognition that everything she'd believed about her own capabilities had been proven inadequate by reality. I made a decision that surprised me with its spontaneity. I walked over to her front porch, stepping carefully around the workers who were running hoses and electrical cables into her house. "Janet," I said when I reached the bottom of her porch steps, "is there anything I can do to help?" She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her internal debate playing out across her face. Her pride wanted to maintain the pretense that she could handle this crisis the same way she'd always claimed to handle everything else. But her desperation was stronger than her pride, and desperation won. "I don't know what to do," she said, and her voice broke on the admission. "This is going to cost more money than we have, and I don't know how to fix it, and I can't." She stopped, pressing her lips together to keep from crying in front of me. "Have you called Complete Care Solutions?" I asked gently. "Miguel mentioned he'd done an assessment for you. They might be able to help coordinate the different types of work you need and work out payment arrangements." Janet's expression shifted, and I could see her remembering our previous conversations about professional help and real women and self-reliance. The words she'd used to criticize my choices were now being offered back to her as a potential solution to her crisis. "I talked to them once," she admitted, "but the cost seemed like too much, and I thought I could handle the foundation issue myself if I just researched it enough and found the right materials." She looked back at the emergency workers carrying pumps and dehumidifiers into her basement. "Now I'm facing $25,000 in repairs because I waited too long to get professional help." The admission hung between us like a confession. Janet had spent years positioning herself as the neighborhood authority on proper home management, criticizing anyone who chose professional help over self-reliance. Now she was acknowledging that her approach had led directly to the catastrophic failure she was experiencing. "It's not too late to call them," I said. "They're good at working with insurance companies, and they can prioritize the work based on what's most urgent. Miguel's really knowledgeable about foundation issues." Janet nodded slowly, but I could see her struggling with the psychological weight of admitting she needed help. "It's just hard," she said finally. "I've always been the one who took care of everything. Dale works, and I manage the house, and I've always been proud of being able to handle whatever came up." "You can still be proud of that," I said, "but handling things sometimes means knowing when to call in experts. That's not failure, that's good judgment." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're being very kind, considering how I've acted toward you." That was as close to an apology as I was likely to get from Janet, and I appreciated the acknowledgement more than I'd expected to. "We're neighbors," I said. "Neighbors help each other." One of the emergency workers approached us, removing his work gloves and looking like he had more bad news to deliver. "Ma'am, we've got the immediate flooding under control, but I need to tell you about what we found down there." Janet's shoulders tensed. "What now?" "The electrical panel took on water. We've shut off power to the basement for safety, but you're going to need an electrician before we can restore full power to the house. Also, there's some mold starting to develop in the corners where water's been seeping in. You'll want to get that addressed quickly." More problems, more expense, more evidence that Janet's attempt to manage serious structural issues without professional help had led to a cascade of expensive failures. "How much is the electrical work going to cost?" Dale asked, appearing beside us with the defeated expression of someone who'd already heard too much bad news for one day. "Hard to say without a full assessment, but replacing a water-damaged panel and rewiring the affected circuits, probably $3,000 to $5,000. Janet closed her eyes. "So we're looking at $30,000 total. Could be more, depending on what the foundation specialists find. Problems like this tend to reveal other issues once you start digging into them." After the worker walked away, the three of us stood in uncomfortable silence. Janet and Dale were facing financial ruin because of home maintenance problems that had spiraled beyond their ability to manage or afford. They were good people who'd made understandable mistakes, and now they were paying a devastating price. "I'll call Complete Care Solutions," Janet said finally. "Can you give me Miguel's direct number?" I pulled out my phone and shared Miguel's contact information, along with the main company number. "Tell them Sarah Hendricks referred you," I said. "They'll remember the account and might be able to expedite the consultation." "Thank you," Janet said, and for the first time in 2 years, her gratitude sounded completely genuine. "I know I haven't been the easiest neighbor, and I appreciate you helping despite that." It was a moment of honesty that felt significant given our history. Janet was acknowledging both her previous behavior and her current vulnerability, and she was doing it with a dignity that made me respect her more than I had when she'd been presenting herself as perfect. "Call them today," I said. "The sooner they can get out here to coordinate with the emergency crew, the better your options will be." As I walked back to my house, I could hear Janet on the phone with Complete Care Solutions, explaining her situation and requesting an emergency consultation. Her voice was shaky but determined, and I found myself hoping they'd be able to help her find a path through the crisis that wouldn't destroy her family financially. Later that afternoon, I saw Miguel's van pull up to Janet's house, followed by another Complete Care vehicle I didn't recognize. They spent several hours conducting assessments and consulting with the emergency mitigation crew. Through my kitchen window, I could see Janet and Dale following the technicians around, asking questions and taking notes with the intense focus of people whose future depended on the answers they received. The next morning, Janet appeared at my front door. She was dressed in clean clothes and had made an effort with her appearance, but she still looked exhausted and fragile. She was carrying a small potted plant and wearing an expression that suggested she'd been rehearsing what she wanted to say. "Sarah," she began when I opened the door, "I wanted to thank you for yesterday and to apologize for how I've treated you since we've been neighbors." I accepted the plant, recognizing it as one of the flowering varieties from her usually pristine garden. "You don't need to apologize, Janet. You were going through a difficult time. That's not an excuse," she said firmly. "I spent 2 years criticizing your choices because they made me feel insecure about my own limitations. When you hired Complete Care Solutions, it forced me to confront the fact that maybe my approach to home maintenance wasn't as superior as I wanted to believe." This level of self-awareness was unexpected and impressive. Janet was taking responsibility not just for her recent crisis, but for the underlying attitudes that had contributed to it. "What did Miguel say about your situation?" I asked. Janet's expression brightened slightly. "He thinks they can help us work out a payment plan that spreads the costs over 2 years. They're going to coordinate all the different types of work we need and prioritize based on what's most urgent for safety and preventing further damage." "That's great news." "It is," she agreed. "And it's exactly the kind of help I should have asked for months ago, when the problems first started developing." Miguel said most of this could have been prevented with routine maintenance and early intervention. The admission must have been difficult for someone who'd built her identity around domestic competence. But Janet seemed relieved to finally acknowledge the reality of her situation. "The important thing is that you're getting help now," I said. "Houses are complicated systems. There's no shame in needing experts to maintain them properly." Janet smiled, and it was the first genuinely warm smile she'd ever directed at me. "You know what's funny? Miguel said the same thing you did about specialization. He said he wouldn't expect me to design his company's marketing materials, so why should I expect myself to be an expert in foundation repair?" It was satisfying to hear that the perspective I'd tried to share was being reinforced by the professionals Janet was now working with. Maybe the crisis would ultimately lead to a healthier relationship with the realities of home ownership. "Will you be able to stay in the house during the repairs?" I asked. "We'll have to move out for about a week while they do the foundation work, but after that we can live upstairs while they finish the basement restoration."
Janet paused. "It's going to be expensive and disruptive, but Miguel assured us that once it's done, the house will be in better condition than it's been in years." As Janet walked back to her house, I reflected on how dramatically our relationship had changed in less than 24 hours. The crisis had stripped away the pretenses and competitive dynamics that had defined our interactions, revealing two women who were both just trying to manage the complexities of homeownership and adult life. Janet's catastrophic plumbing failure had ultimately proven the value of the professional help I'd been using all along, but the vindication felt less important than the recognition that we'd both learned something valuable about the difference between pride and wisdom. Over the following weeks, I watched Complete Care Solutions coordinate Janet's repairs with the efficiency and expertise that had made my own home maintenance so much less stressful. The difference was that Janet now understood and appreciated what they were doing in a way that my routine maintenance had never allowed me to demonstrate. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in the most expensive packages, and Janet's crisis had been a costly but effective education in the value of professional help and preventive maintenance. The question now was whether our new understanding of each other would survive once the emergency was over and normal life resumed. 6 months after Janet's basement disaster, our neighborhood had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely transformed. The physical repairs to her house were finished, but the changes to our relationship and Janet's perspective on life had proven more lasting than either of us had anticipated. The first sign that Janet's transformation might be permanent came 3 weeks after Complete Care Solutions finished restoring her basement. I was in my front yard planting new flowers when I heard the familiar sound of Miguel's van pulling into Janet's driveway. But instead of the emergency response vehicles that had become common during her crisis, this was clearly a routine maintenance visit. Through the gap in our hedge, I could see Janet greeting Miguel with the enthusiasm of someone welcoming an old friend. She was dressed in practical work clothes rather than her former perfect homemaker attire, and she was carrying a notebook and asking questions about seasonal maintenance schedules. The sight was so fundamentally different from the Janet I'd known for 2 years that I found myself staring in fascination. This was the woman who had lectured me about real women not needing professional help, now enthusiastically discussing preventive maintenance strategies with the same technician she'd once been too proud to hire. Later that afternoon, Janet knocked on my door, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and wearing an expression that suggested she had something important to discuss. "I wanted to update you on how everything's going," she said as I invited her in for coffee. Miguel and his team finished the quarterly maintenance inspection today, and they found a few minor issues that we caught early this time. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, but it was a different kind of pride than she'd displayed during her years of determined self-reliance. This was the satisfaction of someone who'd learned to work smarter rather than harder, who'd discovered that asking for help could be a form of strength rather than weakness. "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased by how well she seemed to be adapting to her new approach. "What did they find?" "A small leak in the upstairs bathroom that could have caused water damage if we'd missed it for another month or 2. Some caulking around the kitchen windows that needs refreshing before winter. Nothing major, but exactly the kind of early intervention that prevents expensive emergencies." Janet had clearly internalized the lessons of her basement disaster in a way that went beyond simply hiring professional help. She'd embraced the philosophy of preventive maintenance and early intervention, understanding that these weren't signs of inadequacy but evidence of good judgment. "You know," she continued, settling into my kitchen chair with her coffee, "I've been thinking a lot about why I was so resistant to the idea of hiring help, and I think it came from a place of insecurity that I didn't even recognize at the time." This level of self-reflection was remarkable coming from someone who'd spent years projecting confidence about her domestic capabilities. Janet was demonstrating the kind of emotional growth that often emerges from surviving a genuine crisis. "What do you mean?" I asked. "When Dale and I bought the house, I made this commitment to myself that I would be the perfect homemaker. I was going to prove that I could manage everything domestic so well that Dale would never have to worry about household issues." She paused, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "But perfectionism is exhausting, and it made me defensive about anything that suggested I might not have all the answers." Janet's insight into her own motivations helped explain the intensity of her previous criticism of my choices. My decision to hire professional help hadn't just been a different approach to home maintenance, it had been a threat to her entire identity as someone who could handle everything herself. "I think I saw your success with Complete Care Solutions as evidence that my approach was wrong," she continued. "Instead of being curious about what you'd learned, I got defensive and tried to tear down your choices to protect my own ego." The honesty was both surprising and refreshing. Janet was taking responsibility not just for her practical mistakes, but for the emotional dynamics that had driven her behavior toward me. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "I have to admit there were times when your comments made me doubt my own decisions. I wondered if you were right, and I was just taking the easy way out." Janet shook her head firmly. "You weren't taking the easy way out. You were making smart choices based on realistic assessments of your time, skills, and priorities." I was the one making poor choices based on pride and stubbornness. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of construction equipment starting up somewhere in the neighborhood. Through my kitchen window, we could see activity at the house 2 doors down from Janet's, where new owners had moved in the previous month. "Oh, that's Linda and Robert Chen," Janet said, following my gaze. "They bought the Morrison place after it sat on the market for 6 months. Nice couple, but they're dealing with some significant deferred maintenance issues." I watched as workers unloaded scaffolding and roofing materials, recognizing the signs of major home repairs in progress. Problems with the previous owners not keeping up with maintenance. "Exactly," Janet confirmed. "Linda mentioned they're looking at about $15,000 in immediate repairs, plus ongoing issues that weren't disclosed during the sale. Roof leaks, outdated electrical, foundation settling that looks familiar to what I dealt with." There was a thoughtful pause as we both watched the activity next door. Then Janet turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, genuine concern for another neighbor's welfare rather than judgment about their choices. "I was thinking about walking over and telling them about Complete Care Solutions," she said. "Not in an intrusive way, but just as a neighbor sharing information about good local resources." The transformation in Janet's perspective was remarkable. 6 months earlier, she would have viewed the Chen family's maintenance problems as evidence of their inadequacy as homeowners. Now she was thinking about how to help them avoid the kind of expensive crisis she'd experienced. "That's a really thoughtful idea," I said. "Miguel's team would be perfect for helping them prioritize the repairs and coordinate with the other contractors they'll need. I keep thinking about how much money and stress I could have saved if someone had encouraged me to get professional help earlier," Janet mused. "Maybe I can spare them some of what Dale and I went through." 2 days later, I saw Janet walking across the street toward the Chen house, carrying what appeared to be a welcome basket and wearing the kind of purposeful expression that suggested she was on a mission of neighborly assistance. From my living room window, I watched her introduce herself to Linda Chen, who was standing in her driveway looking overwhelmed by the scope of the renovation project surrounding her. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes, and I could see Janet gesturing toward both our houses and pulling what looked like business cards from her pocket. When Janet returned, she stopped by my house to report on the interaction. "Linda was so grateful for the information," she said, clearly pleased with how the conversation had gone. "She said they'd been feeling overwhelmed by all the different contractors they need to hire and weren't sure how to prioritize the work." "Did you give her Miguel's information?" "I gave her the Complete Care Solutions contact information and told her to mention that both of us had recommended them," Janet replied. "I also shared some of the lessons I learned about the importance of addressing foundation issues quickly and not trying to handle complex repairs without professional guidance." The irony of Janet now evangelizing for professional home maintenance services was not lost on either of us, but it felt like positive growth rather than simple contradiction. She'd learned valuable lessons from her crisis and was using that knowledge to help others avoid similar problems. Over the following weeks, I watched Janet develop a new role in our neighborhood as an informal resource for homeowners dealing with maintenance challenges. The Chen family hired Complete Care Solutions based on her recommendation and reported excellent results. When another neighbor mentioned struggles with seasonal home preparation, Janet connected them with Miguel's team. When a family 3 streets over posted about plumbing problems on the neighborhood's social media group, Janet responded with helpful advice about emergency mitigation and professional resources. Janet had transformed from the neighborhood critic who judged others for their maintenance choices into a supportive resource who shared practical knowledge and professional connections. The change was so complete that newcomers to the area probably couldn't imagine her previous incarnation as the self-appointed authority on domestic self-reliance. The most significant test of Janet's new perspective came 4 months later when Dale lost his job. His insurance company downsized, and Dale's position was eliminated along with several others in his department. The financial stress was exactly the kind of crisis that would have previously sent Janet into overdrive trying to cut costs by handling all household maintenance herself. Instead, she made a decision that would have been unthinkable during her old approach to crisis management. I learned about Dale's job loss when Janet called me on a Thursday evening, asking if we could talk. She arrived at my door 20 minutes later looking worried but not panicked, carrying the kind of focused energy that suggested she was working through a problem methodically rather than feeling overwhelmed by it. "Dale lost his job today," she said without preamble as we settled in my living room. "The company eliminated his entire department, so it wasn't performance related, but we're obviously going to have to make some financial adjustments." "I'm so sorry," I said. "Are you both okay?" "We're managing," Janet replied with a calmness that impressed me. "Dale's already started reaching out to his network, and his severance package gives us a few months to figure things out, but I wanted to ask your advice about something." The fact that Janet was asking my advice about anything was remarkable given our history, but the nature of her question proved even more significant. "I've been thinking about our household budget and looking for areas where we can reduce expenses," she continued. "The obvious place to cut would be our Complete Care Solutions contract, since it's not absolutely essential and represents several $100s a month." I could see where this was heading, and I was curious about how Janet would resolve the conflict between financial pressure and her newfound appreciation for professional home maintenance. "But every time I think about canceling the service," she said, "I remember what happened when I tried to handle everything myself. I remember the $25,000 basement disaster and how much worse our financial situation would be if we were still dealing with those repair costs on top of Dale's job loss." Janet had reached the core insight that separated her new perspective from her old approach. Professional maintenance wasn't an unnecessary expense, but an investment in preventing much larger financial catastrophes. "So what are you thinking?" I asked. "I want to keep the service but adjust it to fit our temporary budget constraints," she said. I called Miguel and explained our situation, and he suggested we could modify our contract to focus on essential maintenance only until Dale finds new employment. The solution demonstrated both practical wisdom and emotional maturity. Janet was managing financial pressure without abandoning the lessons she'd learned about the value of professional help. She was finding ways to adapt her approach rather than reverting to old patterns that had proven problematic. "That sounds like a smart compromise," I said. "You get to maintain the preventive maintenance that protects your investment in the house without straining your budget during a difficult time." "Exactly," Janet agreed, and Miguel was incredibly understanding about our situation. He said they work with clients on modified contracts fairly regularly, especially when people are dealing with temporary financial challenges. 6 weeks later, Dale found a new position with a different insurance company. The job came with a modest salary increase and better benefits, and Janet immediately contacted Complete Care Solutions to restore their full maintenance contract. But the experience had reinforced her understanding that professional help wasn't a luxury she could easily abandon but a practical necessity that protected her family's financial security. She'd learned to view home maintenance services as insurance against expensive disasters rather than optional convenience. The transformation in our relationship reached its culmination on a sunny Saturday morning in late spring when Janet knocked on my door carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing an expression of genuine excitement. "Dale got a promotion," she announced as soon as I opened the door. "His new company just made him a department manager, and we wanted to celebrate with the neighbor who helped us through the worst crisis we've ever faced." As we sat on my back patio sharing champagne and reflecting on the events of the past year, Janet made an observation that captured how completely her perspective had evolved. "You know what's funny?" she said, swirling the champagne in her glass. "A year ago, I thought independence meant never asking for help. Now I realize that real independence comes from being smart enough to get the help you need when you need it." The insight represented a fundamental shift in how Janet understood both independence and competence. She'd moved from viewing self-reliance as an absolute virtue to recognizing it as one tool among many for managing adult responsibilities effectively. "I spent so much energy trying to prove I could handle everything alone that I never stopped to ask whether handling everything alone was actually the best approach," she continued. "Now I understand that the goal isn't to do everything yourself, it's to make sure everything gets done well." As Janet left that afternoon, I reflected on how dramatically our relationship had changed since that first morning when I'd heard her crying in her backyard over bills she couldn't pay and problems she couldn't solve. The crisis that had nearly destroyed her family's financial stability had ultimately led to a healthier, more sustainable approach to home ownership and a genuine friendship between neighbors who'd once viewed each other with suspicion and criticism. Janet's journey from proud self-reliance to practical wisdom had been expensive and stressful, but it had also been transformative in ways that went beyond home maintenance. She'd learned to distinguish between productive independence and destructive stubbornness, between genuine competence and performance of perfection. Most importantly, she'd discovered that asking for help when you need it isn't an admission of weakness, but a demonstration of good judgment. The woman who had once lectured me about real women not needing professional assistance had become an advocate for exactly the kind of practical professional support that makes modern life more manageable and sustainable. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come disguised as disasters, and Janet's basement flood had ultimately taught both of us valuable truths about the difference between pride and wisdom, between independence and isolation, between competence and perfectionism. The neighborhood had gained not just a more humble Janet but a more connected community where neighbors shared resources and supported each other through challenges rather than competing over who could maintain the most perfect facade of effortless domestic mastery. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.